Hi everyone, thank you for joining Sarah and I today. We will be discussing fat, sodium, and heart health.
Hi everyone, and thank you for coming and listening to our presentation today. So just as a quick recap of what we've covered so far, in the first video, we just did a general overview of the physical and physiological changes that occur during aging. And we went over some general nutrient healthy eating recommendations for older adults. And the second video, we talked a little bit more focusing in on bone health and about the importance of consuming enough protein as well as calcium and vitamin D. And then last time, we talked about carbohydrates and their role on the gut health. So using fiber and whole grains to support the gut mobility and health in that way. So our last macronutrient that we're going to wrap up with today is fat, and we're going to be talking about that with regards to heart health and also including some sodium education, which sodium means salt, and we will go into that later in this presentation.
Today's objectives are differentiate between saturated and unsaturated fat, explain the best dietary methods for lowering cholesterol and blood pressure, and identify ways to reduce sodium intake.
So why do we need fat? It's important for us to get fat from our diet because it provides us with a cushion in our body. If we didn't have any fat whenever we touched anything, it would really hurt. And so that's one reason it's important that we consume fat so that we can maintain fat stores. For most of us, that's not too difficult, but as you get older, you may find if you have experienced any unintentional weight loss, you can really start to see the effects of that fat loss or muscle loss if you see that. So it's important for us to consume fat in our diet as from a cushion perspective as well as from temperature regulation. So fat helps to regulate our body temperature so that we don't get too cold or too hot and we can maintain that temperature. It also provides structure and helps to increase satiety. So by including fat into our meals, we can go longer without eating because fat actually takes longer to leave the stomach. So you're not going to get as hungry as quickly if you add fat to your carbohydrates and protein. Fat also helps to absorb certain vitamins and minerals that require fat to be absorbed. So for instance, if you do not consume any type of fat when you're taking vitamin D, then your body is not going to be able to absorb that as well. So generally, fat should be about 30% of your total daily caloric intake.
Many people ask the question, are low-fat diets healthy? First, we need fat in our diet. As we just discussed, fat has an important role in functions in our body like temperature regulation and absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. It also provides our body insulation and it provides structure to our cell membranes. Because of this, we don't necessarily need to follow a low-fat diet and it's not necessarily healthier. We will learn about two types of fat in this presentation, unsaturated fat and saturated fat. And essentially saturated fat is the less healthy fat and unsaturated fat is the more healthy fat. We should consume less saturated fat and more unsaturated fat. This is really the recommendation that we should follow. Instead of following a low-fat diet, the best recommendation is for 30% of your total calories to come from fat and to not have more than 10% of those calories to be from saturated fat. The rest of the fat you should consume should be unsaturated fat. So really, instead of following a low-fat diet, you should focus on getting more of the healthy fats in your diet. And it's also interesting to note that a lot of low-fat products that are touted as low-fat have more sugar to add to the flavor because fat adds flavor to our foods. When you take fat away, you need to put something in there to add flavor back, and they use sugar to do that. So low-fat products really may not be healthier in the long run at all.
All right, so as Kennedy mentioned, we lump fat into two main categories, and that is saturated fat and unsaturated fat. So your saturated fat, again, is going to be that more unhealthy fat that we want to limit in our diet. And you can think about saturated fat as something that is solid at room temperature. So for example, a butter has a lot of saturated fat, and at room temperature, it's going to be pretty solid. A lot of your red meats, any type of meat, is going to have some saturated fat in there as well. And there's different amounts depending on what type of meat it is. For example, poultry is not going to be as much. But generally, anything solid at room temperature is probably going to have some saturated fat. Whereas your unsaturated fats, or the healthier types of fats, you can think of as being more liquid at room temperature. So you can think of your oils, even some nuts have a lot of good unsaturated fats that are important, and you want to consume more of those types of fats in your diet.
Saturated fats are considered the less healthy fats because they raise your LDL cholesterol. High levels of LDL cholesterol put you at risk for heart disease and stroke. Some foods that you might find saturated fat in are red meat, butter, lard, and cheese. As I've said before, we recommend that saturated fat be less than 10% of your daily calories and preferably only 5 to 6%. Unsaturated fats help lower LDL cholesterol, so they are considered healthier. They can also help reduce inflammation, make cell membranes stronger. They have a lot of good benefits for the body, and they are found in foods like oils, nuts, seeds, avocado, and fish. And we really encourage you to try to get more of these unsaturated fats in your diet.
Okay, so you know that saturated fat, as Kennedy said, raises your bad or that LDL cholesterol that is not good for your heart health. And unsaturated fat is actually going to help support lowering cholesterol. So by eating and consuming foods with high amounts of unsaturated fat, or those liquid oils and nuts and fish, you're supporting healthy cholesterol levels, which is actually pretty cool. And then there's a couple different types of fats. So we have omega-3 fatty acids. I mean, you may have heard about these before. These are going to be very beneficial for your health. They're especially beneficial for brain health, so cognitive function as well. But what they can do for our heart health is they can help to lower our blood pressure, as well as in our brain, they can help to decrease that cognitive decline. So you also want to be consuming more of those omega-3 fatty acids. And then the trans fats, you may have also heard about these as well. This occurs when they take a liquid fat, such as an unsaturated fat, and they add chemicals, or they add hydrogen to it to turn it into a solid fat. And as you might imagine, that significantly decreases the nutrient value of the fat and actually can pose harm. So what this fat does is, when we consume too much trans fat, we're actually in effect lowering our healthy, or that HDL cholesterol, which is not something we want to do. So again, looking at food labels is going to be your best friend, because it'll show you the amount of trans fat when you're shopping. So making sure you're avoiding saturated and trans fat as much as possible, and increasing your amount of unsaturated and omega-3 fatty acids is going to be the way you want to go.
So our bodies cannot make these essential omega-3 fatty acids, so it's important that we eat foods that are sources of omega-3s. Some of these sources are fish, chia seeds, walnuts, and flax seeds. It's also important to follow proper portion guidelines. You shouldn't get more than 3 grams of omega-3 fatty acids per day.
Absolutely. And when we think about fat, as you know, has more calories than in a gram of fat than your carbohydrates or your protein. So even though there are healthy types of fats, we still want to watch our portion size. For example, nuts are a very healthy food, but this infographic shows you what 100 calories of nuts looks like in the palm of your hand. So you can see here that 4 walnuts or 14 almonds equals 100 calories. So it's very important to be watching your portion sizes when you're consuming these healthy fats, so that you're not overdoing it from a caloric perspective.
So now you may be wondering how you can lower your cholesterol. Here are 3 ways that we recommend. So first, reduce the amount of saturated fat in your diet. This is that less healthy fat we talked about that raises your LDL cholesterol. On the other hand, we recommend increasing your unsaturated fat in your diet, which helps lower LDL cholesterol. We also recommend eating more soluble fiber. This can help lower your cholesterol because fiber reduces the amount of cholesterol that is absorbed into the bloodstream. Regular exercise is also very important for lowering cholesterol. Exercise stimulates cells that move LDL cholesterol from the blood to the liver, where cholesterol is then converted into bile and excreted. So the more exercise you get, the more cholesterol that your body gets rid of. And then it's also important to know that eggs are not evil. They are not bad for your cholesterol. Generally, the recommendation is eating 1 egg a day is actually very good for you and has a lot of health benefits.
All right, and then cardiovascular disease. So we mentioned this in the first video, but basically what this is the general term for any type of heart disease. So it is also the leading cause of death currently in the United States, which is why we want to talk about it in relation to what we can do about it from a nutrition perspective. So what we see is that as people get older, the more likely they are to develop some type of heart disease or a combination of different types of heart disease. Even having diabetes significantly increases your risk for developing heart disease. So heart disease is going to include anything like heart attacks, stroke, high cholesterol, or hypertension, such as high blood pressure.
The risk factors for cardiovascular disease can be split up into genetic risk factors and modifiable risk factors. Genetic risk factors are one that we cannot change. Having family members with diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and of course having family members with cardiovascular disease can predispose you to having cardiovascular disease. You can't change that though. The risk factors that we look at from a nutrition standpoint really are those modifiable risk factors, and these are ones that can be reduced or controlled with behavior change. And so in that heart, we have some risk factors we have some ways that we can change and help control these modifiable risk factors, and they are follow a heart healthy diet, which we will discuss in the next few slides. Exercise regularly, which if you remember from one of our past presentations, you should get 150 minutes of exercise or more per week. Maintain a healthy weight, and this all depends, your healthy weight depends on your gender, your age, your activity level, so the good healthy weight for you is something you should discuss with maybe your nutrition professional or your doctor, and then of course avoiding tobacco products.
So some practical takeaways you can take away from what we've talked about so far is, number one, if you have high cholesterol or know that you are at higher risk for developing high cholesterol, the best nutrition implement that you can do is reduce your saturated fat. Research has found that reducing saturated fat can actually help to lower cholesterol much better than actually reducing cholesterol in your diet. So once again, that's why it's okay to eat an egg a day, because eggs actually don't have that much saturated fat. So that's going to be what you want to do. You also want to increase your fiber, because again, that's going to help combat that high cholesterol and help to lower that a little bit for you. And then the other one is that if you have high blood pressure or hypertension, the biggest thing that you can do in your diet is to reduce the amount of sodium or salt that you are consuming. And then you also want to increase the amount of omega-3 fatty acids that you get from those fish, those chia seeds, those walnuts, so that can also has been shown to help reduce blood pressure.
Research has found that older adults are more likely to get cardiovascular disease, so it is important for older adults to follow a heart healthy diet. This doesn't mean that you automatically will get cardiovascular disease as you age, but this increased risk is why we encourage that you watch your saturated fat, you watch the amount of sodium in your diet, and you increase some of those healthier nutrients like unsaturated fat, omega-3 fatty acids.
The American Heart Association has put out a couple of guidelines for you as well, and they are advocating that we eat and older adults eat more fruits and vegetables, which is not a surprise, more whole grains. Remember, half of your plate should be, or half of your grains, excuse me, should be whole grain sources. And then you also want to focus on consuming more low-fat dairy products because those are going to be lower in that saturated fat, as well as skinless poultry and fish. They have a very low amount of saturated fat compared to other meats. Nuts and legumes are again a good source of that unsaturated fat, as well as non-tropical oils. So this is excluding things such as coconut oil, which we really at this point just don't have enough research on to say whether or not that it's healthy or heart healthy for you. And then to eat less of the things that include added sugars, sugar sweetened beverages or any type of soda or sports drinks are going to be things that you're going to want to avoid or limit because they have a significant amount of sugar with very little fat or protein that can help to limit or help to reduce that effect on the blood sugar. You also want to limit saturated fat, trans fat, sodium, and then focus on staying away from nutrient poor foods. So what I mean by nutrient poor foods are foods that contain more calories and very few nutrients. So these are going to be things like snacky type foods or any type of maybe some takeout food or something that has a lot of calories, is very high in that saturated fat or that sodium, but doesn't provide you with a lot of nutrients. So focusing on more nutrient dense foods such as those fruits and vegetables, those low fat dairy products is going to be more beneficial. And then also consuming less alcohol. So watching how much alcohol intake that you have.
Here are some simple swaps that you can make to reduce some of the saturated fat in your diet. You can swap ground turkey for ground beef. Ground turkey has less saturated fat than ground beef, and it also, when you're cooking with it, it cooks pretty much the same as ground beef. You can swap, you can use Greek yogurt instead of sour cream. Greek yogurt also has a lot more protein than sour cream. So as we know, protein is really important for older adults. Finally, you can use olive oil instead of butter. Olive oil has less saturated fat than butter, and you can use that while you're cooking instead.
So now we're going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about sodium and heart health. So this is going to be a little bit more focused on how we can control that blood pressure with controlling the amount of sodium, or in other words, salt, because sodium is mainly composed of salt.
Now I would like you to think about what your favorite snack is and how important those snacks are to you. If your favorite snack is something like pretzels, chips, salted nuts, there is a good chance that this snack has a lot of sodium in it.
So sodium, once again, is composed about 60% of it, or salt is composed about 60% of sodium. And it is found in processed foods and is mainly found in processed foods and can help or can be the main driver of our blood pressure. So by decreasing the amount of sodium or salt in our diet, we can help to maintain that good blood pressure or help to reduce if we have a high blood pressure. Another thing that salt or sodium does in our bodies is it can cause a fluid imbalance. So if we have more sodium than we should, that's going to compete for the water, which can cause us to become dehydrated or cause other things to occur that shouldn't be occurring because we don't have as much water as we need. So we can kind of combat this by watching the amount of sodium that we are consuming, by drinking more water, and then we're also going to show you some other vitamins and minerals that you want to include and eat more of in your diet so that that can also help to blunt the effects of sodium.
So where is sodium found? What foods are high in sodium? Foods that are high in sodium are cheese, canned soups, frozen dinners, processed meats, chips and pretzels, tomato juice, restaurant foods, and condiments.
So I think of condiments a lot of times as hidden sources of sodium because a lot of times we don't really think about the amount of salt that is going to be in our ketchup or our mustard or our Worcestershire sauce. And so here are 6 examples of some high sodium condiments that you might have in your cabinet and may not even be aware of. So the first is Worcestershire sauce. And this one can be a tricky one because I actually looked at my Worcestershire sauce not too long ago, and it doesn't look like it has that much sodium. But if you look at the portion size is only about a teaspoon. Well, I don't know about you, but when I use Worcestershire sauce, I use way more than a teaspoon. So it's important to think about the serving size and multiply that so that you're getting an accurate amount of sodium that you're actually consuming. Another big one is fish sauce or any kind of soy sauce is generally high in sodium. So what you can do is when you're at the store looking for lower sodium options, or maybe finding some other type of lower sodium alternative that you can use instead of these higher sodium condiments. Broth and stock is notorious for being high in sodium. Again, best thing is to look for low sodium options. Barbecue sauce and salad dressings are another culprits for sodium. And one thing you can do, especially with salad dressings, is to look up some recipes and experiment with making your own. There are so many recipes for salad dressings, and it's really not that hard. It might even save you some money. So be aware when you're shopping, when you're cooking, of what condiments you're using and the amount of sodium that might be in them that you may not even have realized.
So, how much sodium should you be consuming a day? So the goal is that you get 1,500 milligrams of sodium per day. And they recommend that the limit is 2,300 milligrams per day. And the interesting thing about this limit is that 2,300 milligrams of salt is the same as the amount of salt in 1 teaspoon. So that's really not a lot when you think about it. And so it can be tricky to not eat too much salt, and it's really important to read nutrition labels and think about what you're eating every day. And then anybody who's on a sodium restricted diet, has to restrict sodium for any reason, should definitely aim to reach that just about 1,500 milligrams of sodium per day recommendation.
So I don't think it comes as any surprise that Americans eat too much sodium. In fact, currently Americans consume about twice as much as the recommendation. So you saw that just a slide before that, 2,300 milligrams. Currently, Americans are eating about twice as much. And that can be accounted for all of the processed foods that require that excess sodium to help preserve the food, as well as more Americans are eating out, and that restaurant food contains a lot more sodium. And I think that in general, just eating and consuming more food. So it's very important to learn to recognize where high amounts of sodium are contributing in your diet, so that you can just be aware and start to find ways that you can reduce that for a heart-healthy diet.
We are now going to talk about 3 minerals that can help work to blunt the effects of sodium, and these are potassium, magnesium, and calcium.
Potassium is the intracellular fluid regulator in your body, and so it helps to balance out the amount of sodium in your diet. So by eating foods that are high in potassium, we can help to blunt the effects of sodium. And these foods include things like sweet potatoes, tomato paste, even plain potatoes are high in potassium, as well as yogurt, white beans, bananas, winter squash, milk, cantaloupe, and many dried fruits.
Magnesium helps keep potassium and sodium levels balanced. Some foods that are high in magnesium are leafy greens, nuts, whole grain bread, and cereal.
Calcium, you've heard us talk about before, is another mineral that helps to blunt the effects of sodium and balance out that sodium balance in your body. And it can be found in foods such as milk. yogurt, dark green leafy vegetables, orange juice that is fortified with calcium, or other nuts such as almonds.
So here are some practical tips for reducing sodium. So first, avoid the salt shaker. As I said in a previous slide, a teaspoon of salt has just about 2,300 milligrams of sodium, which is the maximum amount of sodium we should be getting every day. And if you think about sprinkling salt on food, it would be really, really easy to put way too much sodium, possibly even past that 2,300 milligrams, that 1 teaspoon of salt on food. So a big practical tip for reducing sodium is preparing meals at home. Meals from restaurants and meals that are frozen or pre-cooked have high amounts of sodium. And when you cook foods at home, you have control over how much salt is in your food. You can choose to use seasonings, herbs, other spices instead of adding salt to the food. As I said, experiment with different seasonings.
Oh, Kennedy, I don't think I can hear you anymore. Did your mic go off?
By 1 to 3 cups per day, decrease their sodium intake by 78 to 235 grams per day. And drinking more water also helps the body flush out the salt and the sodium in your body.
So some no salt seasonings that you may want to experiment with in your own kitchen include basically any type of plain spice or herb that you might have in your spice cabinet. So here are some examples that I have given you. So paprika is that red spice. It can add color or spice to your meats and your sauces. So think about any type of tomato sauce that can add some spice and some flavor without that extra salt. Turmeric is one of my personal favorites. It is a yellow spice, and it can add color to things like eggs or rice. So if you add it to eggs, you get that really beautiful yellow looking scrambled eggs, which I really like, and it has some other health properties as well. Ginger can give you a kick to your salad or your dressings. It is very spicy, and it can give you that extra spice without that added sodium. Vinegar is just a good thing to have in your cabinet. You can add it to soups, such as chilies, or even salads to get more of that vinegary taste. Garlic is a very popular seasoner, and it does not have any sodium in it. You can use it to season vegetables or even grains. And then lemon is one that you may not have thought about, but it is lemon and lime, in fact, provide you with vitamin C, but they can also be used as a flavoring ingredient. So think of squeezing some lemon on a piece of fish or over a salad, and you get a nice fresh flavor with the lemon.
If you are trying to reduce the amount of sodium in your diet, it is important to be an educated consumer and to read nutrition labels. So I'm going to tell you about what these 3 labels might mean on a package. Low sodium means that the product contains 140 milligrams of sodium or less per serving. So the food is lighter in sodium. No salt added means no additional salt has been added to the product, but it doesn't mean that the product is sodium free. It actually has to state that the product is sodium free for that to be the case. Reduced sodium means that the sodium level in the product has been reduced by 25% per serving from the original product. This is one where you really have to read the amount of sodium that is still in the food, because if the original product had 500 milligrams of sodium per serving, there's still 375 milligrams of sodium per serving. So these are the labels that you should look for on foods, but of course, definitely read that nutrition label and definitely read how much sodium is still in the product when you are purchasing items. I'd also like to say here that if you're trying to reduce sodium in your diet and eat less salt, it's going to be not as easy at first, but that your palate and you'll get a taste for those lower salt foods the more of them that you eat.
All right, and now we're going to transition to a little bit different part of our program. This is the last part, And this is designed to be an activity, but for our purposes, I'm just going to go through it. We're going to look at some different recipes and figure out ways we can make them a little more heart healthy. So what we're going to do is look at these 3 different recipes, and I'm going to point out the sources of saturated fat, the sources of sodium, and discuss a little bit about ways that we can make it healthier if you are cooking this in your own kitchen. So the first recipe is a baked spaghetti, and this traditionally has that ground beef. You've got your spaghetti sauce, Parmesan cheese, butter, so lots of different ingredients going on. So how could we make this heart healthy? So when I'm looking at this, I'm going to look at that ground beef. So as Kennedy mentioned earlier in the presentation, we can substitute ground beef for ground turkey if you can tolerate the taste. If you want to work up to that taste, you can even mix the 2 for a little bit, but ground turkey is going to be lower in that saturated fat, and it's going to be help you maintain that heart healthy diet if that's what your goal is. The spaghetti sauce, if it's coming in a jar, that means that it's processed and it may have some more salt. So you may want to look for either a low sodium option, or maybe if you're feeling adventurous, Google a recipe and make it yourself. And then you can control exactly how much salt that you want to put in it. And if you don't want to put any salt, then that's great. This seasoned salt. So again, that's going to be a spice that is going to have salt in it. So again, looking at nutrition labels, looking for salt. So maybe look, if you want to read that label, see what are the spices that they included and make your own spice concoction, if you will, and without that added salt. And then finally for this one, I highlighted the butter because butter, again, we know has that higher saturated fat content. So maybe thinking of ways that we could either reduce that or actually in this one, it doesn't look like it's that much butter, but maybe finding either a soft tub margarine or something that doesn't have quite as much saturated fat would be beneficial. And the second one is a mashed potato recipes. So this is a pretty much basic mashed potato recipe. You see we've got potatoes, we've got some butter, we've got milk, cream cheese. This one has chives on top. So if I'm looking at this from a nutrition perspective, specifically heart healthy, I'm going to focus on that butter, I'm going to focus on the whole milk, and I'm focused on the cream cheese. So once again, that butter, maybe substituting it for a soft tub margarine without as much saturated fat. The whole milk, again, is going to have a lot of saturated fat, so maybe if we can substitute that for either a 2% or a skim milk option, that's going to decrease the amount of saturated fat as well as the calories in these mashed potatoes. And then the cream cheese is probably not as big of an issue, but there are other types of cheese that can be used in place of cream cheese. I think one is called Nutella cheese. I can't remember exactly the wording, but there are other options for that less saturated fat option for cream cheese. And then finally here, a little dessert recipe for you is oatmeal cookies. So once again, if I were looking at this from a nutrition perspective or heart healthy perspective, I would want to focus on that butter, that baking soda, and that salt. So the butter, there are several options here. When you're making a dessert recipe, you can often substitute butter sometimes for oil, depending on the recipe. What I would do with this is a cookie recipe. If you want that moist cookie, and actually I've worked with this recipe before, you can substitute half of the butter with a pureed pumpkin to get a little bit of a pumpkin flavor, or you could use applesauce. And those, you're going to get a little bit different flavor. It's going to decrease the amount of that saturated fat and make it an overall better heart healthy cookie for you. And then another thing to be mindful of with this recipe or any type of baking recipe is that baking soda can contribute to salt. So if you're someone who likes to bake a lot, just be mindful that that baking soda does have sodium in it, and then as well as the salt. So maybe you could experiment with decreasing the amount of salt and seeing if that changes the taste too much. But my guess is that wouldn't affect the taste too much, but would definitely make it a better, heart healthier option. So thank you guys for sticking with it and listening to our presentation today, and we will see you back here in the next video.